So welcome everyone to our Food for Thought speaker series, Picker Center EMPA. Very glad to have you all with us for another Food for Thought session. As Bill will probably mention, we've been running our Food for Thought for over a year now. And we've had wonderful guests join us. And today we're honored to have Todd Jacobson, who's the Senior Vice President of Social Responsibility for the NBA, who's also a professor in our program, and he'll be teaching strategic corporate social responsibility this fall. And he's going to be discussing the rise of corporate activism, the changing landscape of social impact in business. So if you have any questions, please keep them to the end. You could put them in the chat, or you could raise your hand to ask them directly. And this is being recorded, so please be mindful of that. And I'll hand off to Bill to do a little intro before we get started. Thank you, everyone.
Well, welcome everyone, particularly our regulars who we get to see once a week, which is great. I'm particularly honored to have Todd with us today. We've known each other for a long time, and he has been in the forefront of this whole evolution from, business being, the bottom line being a dollar bottom line, and that's it, to corporate social responsibility, to environmental sustainability, to social impact, and back again. So he's really somebody who really has known this field for more than 2 decades and has been at the forefront of it, as has his organization, the NBA, who I have long respected and known, and David Stern, the late David Stern, who both Todd and I were very close to, also a Columbia alum, really came in and changed the world of sports and sports business decades ago. So this is like a family gathering for me. Todd has was a student here at Columbia, has been a professor here for many, many years. At the NBA, he's risen through the ranks to the very top. He's now Senior Vice President of Social Responsibility for not just the NBA, but also the WNBA and the Development League. He too was at the forefront of the NBA going international, and both brought the NBA, but also its corporate social responsibility, NBA Cares, to the world. Also labor relations and involvement of the people who work for the NBA and who are more, I guess the players are now more partners than they are workers. They're rich workers for sure, but I think they're corporate partners as well, sort of like the university, right? The professors are employees, but they're more than employees. So Todd also is very involved. He serves on a number of boards combating child abuse and for UNICEF and for sports. He's also an athlete, was a 4-year letterman in soccer at Cornell. So he's an amazing guy. He lives here in New York with his wife and son. Just a great friend. Oh, and the last thing, we connect again. He worked at the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, which, as many of you know, is near and dear to my heart. So, Todd, thank you so much. I know you hardly have a minute, so we're very grateful to have you here today, and please take over.
Thanks, Bill, and thank you, Jeremy, for kind of making this all possible. Bill is, I'll kind of just start here. I see a lot of familiar faces. Some had the opportunity to have a few of you in my class. I've got a chance to speak to a number of you, and it's just great to see everybody. SEPA and particularly the EMPA program have an incredibly special place in my heart. As Bill mentioned, as a student and now as a professor, I think we all look at Bill as somebody that can provide guidance and support and structure as we think through how we want to tackle things. And I can't thank him for his friendship and guidance and support over the years. He's been a terrific mentor to me and to obviously a number of all of us in the program. So thrilled to be here today and talk a little bit about the rise of stakeholder capitalism and corporate activism. There's been a huge shift in our impact in business over the last year, but this has been something that's building for some time. And those that have taken my class know about this, and I'll have the opportunity to walk you through this today, give you a little bit of history on corporate social responsibility, and talk about the shift that we're seeing that was certainly exacerbated during the pandemic. So next slide, Daniel. So a couple things that I like to kind of set the tone on, and I think this is important. I do this for my class too. The first thing is, I quote two of my famous philosophers. First is Walt Whitman with his statement, "Be curious and not judgmental." I think too often these days we're having conversations as it relates to differences of opinions and how we think and feel about how people are approaching things, certainly politically. But I think what has happened too much is that people are jumping to conclusions and making assessments and bringing their own unconscious bias and emotions into the conversation, and not asking enough thoughtful questions and trying to understand where somebody's coming from. So I like to share this at the beginning of my presentations to make sure that as we ask questions today and talk about this topic, make sure you're open-minded. I know we all have strong opinions, and certainly this last year has just made them stronger. But certainly it is important to make sure that we approach things with an open mind and that we try to learn about things before we jump to conclusions. Second, my second favorite philosopher, Dave Chappelle, he's been talking a lot, and I know there was an incident that happened on Saturday Night Live with Elon Musk joining and a number of cast members that didn't want him to be a part of that. And I found his statement about being, the term woke, and the idea that what that means and how you approach it. And this idea that it's important that people understand that even when you have a strong opinion, even when you feel you're right or you're fighting the good cause, how you go about it, your form and delivery and having conversations is incredibly important. It's not about being right. It's about making sure that you can have a conversation and engage with people. And it's hard to hear people, as Dave shares, if you're constantly behaving or nagging them in such a way that doesn't do that. So, make sure as you're going about this, you keep an open mind, that you think about your form and delivery when you share a thought about how you feel about things, so that you can be inclusive in a conversation and make sure we can tackle these things and hopefully help us all think about and approach things in a more collective manner. So let's just jump right in. So the purpose of today's conversation really is to detail the evolution of the role of business, and what role is business expected to play. For those that were on at the beginning of our conversation, Bill and I were talking about what the work week looks like. Why do we go back, and why do we have a 5-day work week? What's the approach? So many things about business is shifting. And when we talk about social impact, everybody always thinks about externally what they do in the community. But the reality is, for business, it's a philosophy for how they approach and want to build their work and their interaction with the community. And I think that's an important distinction, as how you build your culture, how you recruit and retain talent, what kind of work that you do, how you approach things collectively as an organization is really critical. And we're going to talk a lot about that today, and particularly in the backdrop of everything that's happened during the pandemic. And that's certainly been something that has shifted and changed. And I think we have a lot to come back to and learn from as we return to somewhat normalcy over the coming months, and see how businesses adjust and shift from there. So to start, I just want to take you through kind of a little bit of an evolution. Again, for those that are in my class, you've seen some of this work, but certainly want to share some of these things. It's important as we're talking about business to really kind of ground yourself on how we got to where we are today. I think it'll help us frame the conversation and help you think about this a little bit different. And so when you think of corporate social responsibility, it's really how businesses interact with society. I always think at a given point in time is a really important distinction, as things are so dynamic and shifting. But really, this concept started around the Industrial Revolution. The idea, we talked about Henry Ford and setting the work week. This idea that the reorganization of society around corporations and business was really important. If you remember, the Industrial Revolution was really about farmers making that transition to cities and urban communities to get better, high-paying jobs. And all of a sudden, businesses need to compete, right? They needed to recruit the best talent. They needed to make sure that people stayed high, so their productivity is high. So ultimately, they can deliver a stronger bottom line. And so you saw businesses start to compete here. I always think the most interesting story I always look at is, I don't know how many of you have been to Hershey, Pennsylvania, but certainly Milton Hershey during the late 1900s or early 1900s, when he built up the community of Hershey and created the park for his employees. He created a home for orphans in that area that is still open today. He created community gardens, again, with the idea that if you create a culture and a community that people want to be in, you'll be able to recruit, retain talent, you keep high productivity, and you can be successful as a business that this was important to ultimately the bottom line. And so you started to see some of these remnants of how business was very important and how they're going to take distinct advantage of this. But it wasn't really until the 50s when an economist named Howard Bone came around and wrote an interesting book called The Social Responsibility of the Businessman. And he really was the first to introduce the concept of modern corporate social responsibility. The idea of that business has a responsibility. What should they be thinking about? How do they approach this work? He's seen as kind of the father of CSR, but he was really the first to raise these questions as, what is that responsibility that business has to society? How should they be approaching that? What does that mean? That really, that kind of shifted into the 70s where you had, one of the most famous, I think, Columbia alum in Milton Friedman. He got his PhD at Columbia, another economist. He wrote a very famous paper about social responsibility in business, one that basically said the social responsibility of business is to maximize your profits. So what Bill talked about in terms of the bottom line, this idea of, if you want business and you want to be successful and you want to help society, maximize your profits, take care of your employees, if you want to write a check, certainly write a check. But the idea here that if you're a successful business, you will ultimately be doing your part to make society and culture better. That was most important. Your shareholders, if you can do that, they will then in turn give back to the communities, and the different sectors can play their roles, civic society, government, in doing the other things that they need to do. Milton won a Nobel Peace Prize for his work. This was certainly part of it. And this became the long-standing view of business, and still in a lot of ways is today, right? This is a point that we debate. We debate in my class quite a bit about where does this sit on business? What ultimately is the goal of business? But more importantly, I always ask the question, how is business going to be most successful? So let's really start from a point of sustainability. And that's an important frame that we'll kind of talk through throughout the remainder of this kind of presentation. In the early 80s, a famous case came along that really started the first kind of example and was a landmark case in reputation management, which was really what CSR was when it started, right? It was about a company managing their reputation externally to the best they could to make sure they look good so they can maximize their profits. In 1982, the Tylenol case, these are known as the Chicago Tylenol murders, someone went around and put cyanide in Tylenol capsules and put them into the containers, into drugstores, and 7 people were killed. This obviously was really dramatic, and Tylenol wound up recalling all their products and really had to go on a reputation piece about talking to their stakeholders, about exchanging products. The tamper-proof, the piece that you can't get off any type of drug that you buy today that's really hard on your nails. That came from this case. The idea that you need to seal and that what you're buying is safe was the first time a company, in this case Johnson & Johnson, that produces Tylenol, really had to take this on. And you see the elements of social responsibility, how to manage crisis, how to communicate to stakeholders, looking at your reputation, how do you solidify this? This is a fascinating case for those of you that are interested in it. I do recommend you do some research here, but it really I would say, was the landmark case for companies looking at how do you handle crisis communication and reputation as it relates to your product and consumers during times when you want to make sure that you can keep your business going and make sure that it continues to be strong. And this was certainly the case with J&J and Tylenol. As we progress, social responsibility is still really in its infancy stage here, mainly as a reputation tool, mainly for companies that you feel would need that type of reputation. You think about companies, that are really good at CSR, they're extracting companies, pharma companies, others that have really had to make sure that, their reputation in doing business and how they engage with stakeholders was incredibly important, given that their work obviously necessarily wasn't the best for social good as it relates to overall. And so, managing the reputation became very important. But as we entered into the 90s, you had something called the triple bottom line. This is something that came around. John Elkington, who's a serial entrepreneur, came up with the idea of the 3 Ps: people, planet, and profit. So the idea that obviously we had talked about, that maximizing profits was most important. Here comes John Elkington and says, yes, profits are important, but companies cannot do that without also taking a look at the social and environmental concerns that come when they do business, that the intersect between these things looks at sustainability. And it's really important to look at this. The reason I share the triple bottom line is it's a really interesting concept. I think you will when you look at it or read about it, and for those that are familiar with it, know it really set the table for how we report and measure frameworks, particularly what the UN has used over time. But really, I think it doesn't integrate the full cost of doing business, but you see this start of you need to be a little bit more strategic about how you approach your business, how you think about things. Yes, you still want to maximize profits, but at the same time, what is this interaction that's happening? You can't just really be kind of singularly focused. You have to incorporate stakeholder management and these other elements into what you're doing to consider the cost benefit of those things and how it impacts your day-to-day growth as a company. Next slide. So as we kind of entered into this, I think it wasn't until kind of the late 90s, early 2000s that you saw what most people feel is kind of corporate social responsibility today. This idea of corporate citizenship really took rise, particularly, in companies that you might remember that were really early on and very good at this, the Starbucks of the world, particularly in terms of setting aside their brand for what you felt about them and who they were and how they went about conducting their business and relationship to their communities and where they are, creating places that you wanted to be in, even though they were mass produced, was really important. You saw this very much so in the cosmetic business with MAC and others taking on, since HIV/AIDS was at its really out of prominence at this point. That community obviously was very impacted and felt really important about taking steps to go above and beyond to make sure they're addressing the awareness around HIV/AIDS and certainly combating some of the stereotypes and myths that existed around the disease at the time. So you saw this rise of corporate citizenships, companies standing for something larger than themselves, getting involved. I think this kind of led to companies that you see now, the Toms of the world and others that really kind of, you feel this endemic nature of their brand being so responsible to the community and what they do. And so you saw that rise in the early 2000s. Around 2005, an interesting piece happened in business. And this is important as we look today. The first piece being the UN Principles on Responsible Investing. So the PRIs were created by Kofi Annan and announced. And really what this did on the UN side is really kind of say there are measurements and things that we should be looking at as businesses when we do work, that we should make sure that when we're going to invest, that companies are going about things the right way. This was the start of what is called ESG, or environmental social governance. It's an area that has grown rapidly in business for those that are involved. Your business in one way, shape, or form is now involved in it. By 2030, $1 trillion, which is nearly 1/3 of US assets under management, will go through an ESG lens. Investors like BlackRock, PIMCO, JP Morgan are building up their ESG shops right now. And what it is really, it's an investing tool for companies to look at lens of how they're doing their investments and why they're doing their investments, and making sure that companies pass this ESG sniff test in terms of, are they approaching the environmental work that they're doing well, particularly if you're investing in real estate or building? What's the social and governance impact of the work that companies are doing if you're doing things globally? But it really started the conversation. I will say with ESG, it is still very much an area in its infancy. And I think it's going to require a lot more, but you're seeing a lot more investment in there, particularly over the last few years. A number of the houses have built up their ESG teams, and they're going to continue to grow this space, particularly in the investment areas financially. I know the UN does this well, but you're starting now to see it in the financial sector as well. The idea of creating shared value was something that then came along, and also around 2006, 2007, two professors from Harvard, Porter and Kramer were kind of coined the phrase, although we've seen elements of it before. And it's this idea of doing well by doing good. It's a philosophy I took on very early on. Candidly, I was doing this work kind of before they coined the phrase, but they coined a very catchy phrase. So I thought it was something we should share. The idea here that, you can do well and do good, and they're not mutually exclusive. That they even argued that from a capitalist standpoint, that if you're able to create centrality, the idea that your work that you're doing to better communities is in direct line with your goal as a business, that you are going to create a competitive advantage, and it's really the future of capitalism. If you're able to find a way to marry the two, it'll be a competitive advantage moving forward. And we saw a lot of companies start to do this. It was a very popular way. I love the thinking because it was an integration in business, not just what we call value distribution. Most companies at this time, when they raise money, as you know, they write checks to nonprofits, right? Or to civic groups. That's how companies gave out money. That is what you would call value distribution, right? There's no direct tie to your business. Sure, it's a good thing to do, and it's a nice thing to have. But in general, as you're thinking about these things, there wasn't what we call value creation, something when you're investing in something that can also be good for your business. For example, creating a pipeline of employment, right? If you wanted to do something like that and filtering it back to your company. The idea of doing well by doing good and aligning is something that I tried very hard to do through NBA Cares at the NBA. The argument that if we did more of this, people would feel better about our players and help our business was something we really dove in on and leaned in on. You know, to Bill's point, David Stern was somebody, an early adopter of this as a CEO. A lot of CEOs have adopted this later on, but this was the first piece of it and an important piece of business, and business really looking at this more strategically. Around the time of 2010, you saw this rise of social enterprise. And I should couch this by saying, in 2008, there was a big period of time when you saw this kind of shift going on in business as a whole. You had the global financial crisis where people lost a lot of confidence in banks and certainly business as a whole. And businesses needed to rethink how they were. And what you saw from this was a shift in kind of trust, right? Crisis breeds innovation. And so you saw this enterprise movement. A lot of these pieces, impact investing has been around a long time, but now has become more of a fad. That's why I'm sharing it now. Companies looking at how to create funds that are both nonprofit and for-profit, a mix. You're seeing a lot more of these ideas, the rise of B Corps as a kind of focal point in business, this idea of venture philanthropy about using similar to what they do for angel investing and financial investing, seeding money to a number of nonprofits. And when one or two did very well, investing more in those nonprofits. So creating a little bit of a portfolio. You're seeing this different approach to how do you integrate business and social good and not only driving good, but also making profit along the way. So the social enterprise movement started to happen and happen more. And then around the 2016 election, when my classes shifted and everyone became so passionate talking about this, I always think this is when you started to see a shift in business. This idea, I coined this phrase, the idea of a corporate statesman, the idea that now, particularly after the 2016 election, which was a surprise to many, but where we elected a businessman as president, you're seeing this shift that people were looking to business for more than just profits. People wanted to understand what role business played in society, what role CEOs can have there. More was expected and more was wanted from CEOs to weigh in on things and companies to do things. They wanted to understand that before a company, for example, launched an IPO, what were they about? Companies like WeWork and others lost out on IPOs that were really built on kind of strong kind of community philosophies, and then it didn't get backed up necessarily. So you're seeing this rise of more is expected of business rather than just managing reputation through your CSR, that you're seeing this shift that's going on. And I think this is most important because it kind of leads to kind of, the main part of the conversation here, which is the rise of stakeholder capitalism. Next slide, Daniel. So the rise of stakeholder capitalism, to give people an idea, stakeholder capitalism is the concept that it's not just about your investor or shareholder, that you as a company, just like you do stakeholder management, you need to look at your shareholders and decide what level of interest and engagement you have overall as you think about driving your business, which means sometimes the shareholder investor is most important, sometimes it's the employee, sometimes it's a partner. You need to be more creative and understand that you can't just make your last decision based on your investors. Now, this concept has floated around. A number of business leaders thought it was a fad. You had this argument around Milton's piece of like, it's just business in the guise of doing good. Let's not talk about it. But in 2019, the Business Roundtable, which really makes up a lot of the CEOs of the company, came together around the US and basically said, no, this is not a fad. If you want a sustainable, successful, competitive business that is responsible, you need to start looking at how you as a business better society. That you can't just look at your investors. You need to see how you're going to better the economic benefits for all your stakeholders, your employees, your consumers, your partners, whatever it might be. How does that work? Yes, your investors are part of that, but now there's a shift in how you need to operate and think about things. This was even more taken to the next step when in 2021, Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, he sent out a very bold letter. he holds, BlackRock is one of the top investors, basically saying we need to shift how we invest and how we do business. That if we want to be sustainable, we want to be more competitive moving forward, we need to look at stakeholder capitalism and how we invest. We can't just look at making money for our shareholders and for our investors. We need to look wider than that, that if we do that, we will still be able to do really good work for our investors. That is really important. And that was a real general shift that happened. So you're seeing this shift really from the business standpoint. I know I spent a lot of time on that. It's important to understand this framing and movement you see over time. It used to be traditional sectors. You have government, nonprofit, right? Civic engagement and business. Now, all of a sudden, they're blurring together and people are looking at business for leadership. People are looking for business to do these things. Well, business is going to need to shift to adapt to that. And what does that mean? And we're going to go into that now. And then all of a sudden the pandemic happens, which was, we're all hopeful, a once in a lifetime event, but certainly something that shifted everything, right? It was incredibly politically charged. There was a reckoning around social justice, particularly in this country with a lot of the racial murders. A lot happened. And this really accelerated putting business front and center in a way it has not been before, right? We've talked about it. I've always kind of hinted at it. I believed it, but this is the first time it even went beyond me of having to push it. All of a sudden, this became the topic of all conversations. And the really kind of three things we saw. The first, I mentioned the rise of social justice and corporate activism. In social responsibility, we did mainly community programming. All of a sudden, there was this shift where employees and the relationship between the business employees became critical and central to survival, right? Companies were trying to survive during a time when they didn't know if they can keep their doors open. They had to keep their employees working and engaged at a time when their employees were facing challenges they've never faced before. What does that look like? How do you address these issues? How do you take on stances, right? All of a sudden, these issues, social justice, dealing with race issues and gender issues, were really third rail issues companies necessarily didn't want to stay, really engage in. And they certainly didn't want to engage in politics. It was, very politically charged. Now, all of a sudden, no choice. Everybody is pushing them in this direction. It's not just what companies think, but people want to know what CEOs and C-level think personally. All you have to do is look, in that they were saying, well, it's nice the company thinks this, but if the CEO invests personally this way, we know that that's the way this person thinks about it. So all of a sudden, you have this outsized piece. Now, with that double-edged sword also came this outsized influence of business on society. I saw it with the NBA, but I saw it with a lot of business. The influence we had on the election, for example, the presidential election in 2020. We opened up 23 of our arenas. The amount of voting, our goal was always not about choosing a side. It was always nonpartisan. It was the idea that at the very basic nature, every citizen has the right to vote, and that's what we want to promote. That's it. And I was really kind of steadfast on that. Everybody wanted us on both the right and left to take a side. It's like, this is not about a side. This is about us playing a role to do that. But it was certainly an outsized role. You saw our players were outspoken. You certainly saw other businesses were outspoken. We've seen a number of businesses sign on against some of the voting restrictions. Baseball moved the All-Star game. You're seeing a lot now. I know HR 1 died the other day, but you're seeing a lot around the George Floyd Policing Act come to life, the Equity Act. So there's all of a sudden this convergence of business and politics and societal issues became front and foremost. And businesses didn't know how to react. They're still trying to figure it out. And this is important. And then this greater alignment, this acceleration of the alignment of betterment of society and bottom line. This is not just about maximizing your profits anymore. People will hold you accountable if you're not going about doing things the right way, which will ultimately affect your bottom line. It'll affect your ability to be productive because you won't have the right culture or employees to be able to do it. It'll affect the way you partner, as companies aren't going to want to work with you. It'll affect being able to go public, as people aren't going to want to invest in you. And we've seen this more and more, that it's not just about putting out a press release or managing your reputation or even shared value, that you as a company really needed to stand for strong, authentic values and principles at which long-term in which you are going to guide your business, of how you're going to act, behave, and work moving forward. And I think this is becoming an important thing. What I like to say is defining your why as a business all of a sudden became critical for doing business in a way we haven't seen before. Next slide. So some of the stats I would share with you along the way here. I think first, business's role in society. So you can see some of these things. I've shared this study throughout time. The Global Strategy Group is one of my favorite that does this work in the space, and this has continued to grow. And you can see here, 84% of Americans believe that business have a responsibility to bring about change. That number has increased, accelerated quite a bit over the last 5 years, and continues to be a really important line here, that people feel businesses need to be engaged here, that it's not just the political winds of change. You need to invest in this and invest early. And that not only if you do that, but most Americans feel that if you do that, that corporations can succeed while also taking a stance on important issues. I would argue that if you don't take a stance on issues and know who you are, whether liberal or conservative, or really clear about your values, it'll actually be detrimental to your business now. That companies that don't weigh in or try to weigh in haphazardly without a process, without the right structure in place, even companies traditionally that have been really good in this space for a long time, or companies that have a terrific reputation, have made significant missteps here because they're trying to overreact and they're course correcting. So companies are going to need to think about how they engage here in society, because society is expecting more of business overall. This is especially true in the new workforce, right? Where you have this new generation coming in. We saw it certainly to the pandemic at the NBA. A lot of people outspoken, a lot of people wanting to share how they think. Gen Zers believe their companies must take action. This rise of, it's great to do nice community work. How are we responding to the political issue? How are we responding to the rise of anti-Asian hate? How are we responding to the rise of anti-Semitism? How are we responding to the rise of Black Lives Matter? And what are we doing? How can I get involved personally? What are we doing? These things became really important, and people became incredibly vocal internally about what are we doing as a company and where we're seeing this. And we saw this through a lot of companies. I mean, AT&T, for example, charges their employees to really drive what the company is going to support in the local communities. So this new workforce of really this activism of employees getting involved beyond their typical work role is really critical to their success in building a good culture. It also determines where you work. I mean, we see it all the time. It's a lot easier to recruit when your company has a reputation of a place of people, I want to be a part of something larger than myself that's doing good work. And when you're competing for talent and you're trying to create diversity and inclusion within your organization, this is incredibly important. And as businesses look at this, they're going to have to really recognize this. And certainly from a consumer standpoint, that's important as well. Next slide. So, we talked about social justice work, and the Business Council, made up of CEOs, also put out this statement during the pandemic following the murder of George Floyd and into the summer about what business needs to do. What does the community need to do to really address, what's going on about the inequities, the systemic inequities that exist in our system. And really, you could see here, it was really about providing access to jobs and mobility. What can companies do to do this and really kind of narrow the economic gap? And I bring this up because I'll talk about some of our work in the MBA, but I did want to raise this because it is important. The hardest thing that you can do during this time is not be able to recognize and take a step back and think about what ways you could do things differently. We all have unconscious biases in terms of how we approach things, but the facts don't lie. And the facts are that if you look at Fortune 500 companies, there's only 4 CEOs, and there were 3 during the pandemic, that are Black. Only one woman, and that woman, Rosalind Brenner, started as the CEO of Walgreens this March, right? So clearly, from a career advancement standpoint and evaluation of talent, it hasn't been there, just based on the fact that it doesn't exist right here, based on look at Fortune 500 makeup. The other piece that I always found very interesting when we were doing this work is that the idea that even if you can do these things, that a Black college graduate or a white person that graduated with either a GED or high school diploma, when you look at their career earnings, the white person with the GED or high school diploma is going to make more than the Black college graduate is telling. It shows that there are inequities within the system that need to be addressed if you're addressing inequity particularly around the economic gap overall. And so businesses have a real kind of important role to play here. We want to make sure it's more of a holistic approach in terms of looking not just at what you can do externally, but how you're operating as a company. And I think this was a reckoning that is continuing to go on and is important for businesses to look at. And it's not just for the Black community. I know obviously that's been the focus. It's for all kind of, as you look at gender, when you look at all different pieces, companies really need to kind of take a deeper dive and really own where they are in order to get better here. Next slide. The most important piece I would share with you that I found fascinating during this time is this piece of information that came out from Edelman in May 2021. And the question they posed was, how much do you trust this institution to do what is right? Now, I share this with you because this is in the backdrop of the pandemic, when all of a sudden this craziness has happened and we're all isolated. All of us have been through trying times, certainly others more than most. We went through a social justice reckoning, all these things going on. And the group and the company that people work for was seen largely, and by the way, heads and above, the place that people trusted, wanted to get information more so than traditional areas of information and work, more than government, more than nonprofit organizations, more than the media, and more than other businesses that might specialize in certain things. People were coming, I know, to the MBA and asking, what do I need to do from a health and wellness standpoint? How should I be thinking about social justice? It is a shift that I saw, and I've been in this business, to Bill's point, over 20 years, that I've never seen before. Conversations were more personal, more intimate. People were passionate, but people really relied on us for information, for engagement. And talking to my colleagues across business, this was fairly common. People were turning to their companies and asking, what do I need to do? Well, this really shifts the dynamic between employer and employee, right? All of a sudden, those traditional pieces are fading away, and an employee is looking to an employer for more than just work. They're looking for all aspects of their life to be supported, particularly during the pandemic. That is a huge statement and really a major shift in how businesses need to think about how they approach things. And people ask, well, how does this tie into social impact? It very much does, right? The idea of your impact is your impact on society. How you work with people in your company, how you approach your culture and build and retain and work with partners, how you go about doing your work is as important as your external manifestation of that, right? It's all holistic in how you approach it. And companies need to rethink this. And this is the most telling stat, I think, that I came across during the pandemic. Next slide. So the world's changed. What does a business need to do to continue to grow and be successful? And there's a lot here, and I wish we had more time to discuss it. I think what I'm going to try to do is there is no answer here that is right. And I never want to give anybody an answer right, because you all need to think through it. You all are very intelligent, smart people that work, that have thoughts and feelings about how you want to approach this work. And you should be asking yourselves these questions. But I can tell you that every day I open up the paper, I open up, because I'm old, I like to read the paper, or I'm opening up my browser, or I'm reading something on social media. I come across ways in which companies are trying to attack this, both good and bad. And it is a fascinating time because we're at this point, an inflection point of how business is going to deal with this. And the only thing I'll say is that without, people always say, do you have to be fast? And I'm like, in my mind, what you need to do is you need to have really clear values and principles about who you are as an organization. And that has to be understood from the CEO to the person that answers the phones. It doesn't matter. You need to have a clear understanding of who you are and why you stand for something, so that you have a foundation to attack problems, right? We can't control outcome. The world is a crazy place right now. Things are shifting daily. You need to have a good foundation and a good process to address these things. And if you have those things, you at least have a way in which you can approach things in a more kind of deliberate and thoughtful way that reflects how you as an organization and as a culture and as a community and a business want to attack that. And I think the companies that have done that have had a lot of success in doing that. So I'm going to share right now about the MBA, then I'll open it up for questions so you can see a little bit about what we did during this time. So next slide. So the first thing that we did was really kind of take a look at exactly what I just said, which is like, who are we? Like, so much has happened over the course of the last year. For us, we had the bubble in which we operated. I think a lot of you are probably fairly familiar with how the MBA has attacked a lot of this work. What are we going to do from a social impact standpoint? Well, first I said is like, it's not about the work or the tactics. We as an organization have to be clear who we are and why we're doing this. And so we've started a process to refresh our league mission. We've always, as a league led by David, started a mission in 2000 where we wanted to be the most successful league in the world by using the power of our brand and celebrity of our players to address important social issues. The best mission in the world, because it's not my responsibility, it's the collective responsibility of everybody in the business to make that happen. I'm just a facilitator of that. And so we wanted to bring that to life again in our mission for the company, to be reflective of the social justice work that we were now doing more of, and wanted to bring that to life so that regardless of what you do, you had some accountability around the work. And that would flow into our purpose and our core principles. And the reason I laid these out before the work is I felt it was important that people understand it's not about what we're doing. It's why we approach things and how we approach things. And these ideas of being purpose-driven, about being proactive at addressing problems, about empowering people to share your voice, even if you don't agree with them within our family, about being inclusive of stakeholders and meeting them where they are. And most importantly, about bringing humility to the work. I mean, businesses don't tendency to have a lot of humility. And the reality is this work requires humility. It requires a different level of skill set than businesses have been asked before. Reacting to the issues of society, being held accountable for making a difference by stakeholders across the spectrum. Your relationships with employees being deeper than it was before. This is new, and you have to be authentic and real, which means that there's going to be some growing pains. And I think you have to realize that and be open to that and be vulnerable to that as an organization so that it's real. And so we had these principles. And so we laid that work out, but it really became what I wanted to do is like, sure, this is kind of how we're going to approach it. This is our foundation, but let's lay out the work that we're doing so that people are clear about what it is and what this work is and defining it. And so I laid out social impact, which is really the collective accountability of all your efforts to really improve things around the world. For us, it's through the power of our game to advance racial and social equity, create greater economic opportunity, engage in important social issues. And there's 5 main ways we did that. We talked about MBA Cares. It's been our bread and butter for 16 years, our programming. It's what I've led. It's been very good around our community engagement programming. However, we needed to grow and do more. And during the pandemic, we launched both the MBA Foundation and the MBA National Basketball Social Justice Coalition. The foundation was a $300 million investment, $1 million a year from each team. So each of the 30 MBA teams, so 30 million over 10 years to invest in economic empowerment in the Black community with a focus on employment and career advancement. So that the focal point of our foundation is really in that 14 to 24 age group, focusing on your first job, your job out of either high school, GED program, 2-year vocational school, or a 4-year school. And then that career advancement, that young kind of new person in the workforce that has done well, that has gone to business school, that has done all these things, but maybe their career has stalled mid-level. They need about pipeline development and things. How do we kind of get those roadblocks out of the way? And also looking at the systemic nature of the work and understanding that while these are good solves and important, we need to make sure that we understand if the system is rigged, it's not going to help long term. And so we needed as the MBA to invest more here. To date, we've given out over $12 million of grants in 6 months, and we're looking to do a spend down. So we'll look to give out more there. The coalition, hold on, Daniel, go back, is really focused on police and criminal justice reform and voting legislation. We've done a couple of pieces there. The interesting thing about both the foundation and coalition, for people to be aware, it includes our governors, which are our owners, our players, the head of the Players Association. We have a Players Association, which is a union, the head of our business, who is Adam, who is our commissioner, as well as our coaches. So it's all the key stakeholders sitting around a table, weighing in on these issues collaboratively. We felt that was important. And be clear, not everybody feels the same way. We have Republicans and we have Democrats. And it's important because the only way you're going to find consensus and move legislation is if you find common ground. And we know that, and that compromise is important, and you need to figure it out. And so what role can we play there? So new entities that are going to do that. Our social justice programming ramped up. We launched a new program in Africa around gender equity for women. So we're doing this globally. And our DEI commitments to really making sure that we're hiring, retaining talent. We're doing listening exercises. We're taking a look at our culture to make sure that these values we're expelling externally, are we living them internally? Does everybody feel the same way? These are tough conversations, but you can't be afraid of them if you're going to grow. So this is how the work all kind of lays out in our world. Next slide. And I would just kind of end on this in terms of this is how that works out. This is what it is. So the work kind of comes to life in 4 ways: through programming, advocacy, philanthropy, and partnerships. We engage, across the work in 3 different ways that works very well. Stakeholder engagement is most important right now. So how we communicate and how we engage with different stakeholders became a lot more important for us in terms of how we communicate. We communicate every day with employees, with players, with coaches about all these different issues that we're tackling, whether it be legislation, how we're doing granting, programming around social justice or cares, commitments that we can do to kind of help everybody grow. And so we will do that and continue to do that. How we tell our story and how we market it is really important as well. We are a league and we have to grow our business, but it has to be authentic to our story. And so the marketing and content cuts across this work, as does our business practices and growth. To be a purpose-driven business, you need to integrate your DEI commitments, which are our diversity, equity, and commitments to how we hire and retain, who we work with as partners, what we're doing, how we measure this work, and how you measure it in your day-to-day work. So I go to the legal department and say, how does this impact what you do? Because everybody needs to own this. And these three areas became our kind of core outcome areas and our tactics at which we try to build our social impact umbrella to tie all the initiative work together, the 5 initiatives I laid out below on the last slide, as well as kind of our key initiative, which is driving impact through that work, right? How are we going to change legislation? How are we going to narrow the economic gap? How are we going to create more great community programming around the world? How are we going to instill these DEI commitments so that we're hiring better, not just kind of our employers, but our coaches, right? Our general managers, everything around our business. And so, we wanted to make sure that everything connected, and we are now building out a roadmap in these areas so that we as an organization are doing a better job in being proactive at doing that. So that's how we attacked it, but we're learning like everybody else as we go and trying to build this out. So I'll wrap and then I'll leave it open for about 10 to 15 minutes of questions, but kind of key takeaways here. And I always lead with this one because I think it's important to continue to do. You got to be mission driven and values led in what you're doing. And that is critical as a business these days. You can't just live those words. You need to be clear about the values that you're going to do your business, not how you're going to do your community work, how you're going to do your business. I really mean that. I always get asked like, well, this company's really good at community work. I'm like, well, I always use the analogy, if you work out 2 hours a day, are you healthy? Well, not if you're drinking and smoking at night. And that's the same thing for a company. You can't just do good things in the community and then do your business another way that's detrimental. You need to look at things holistically, and that is incredibly important. And companies are going to be held to task on this. If you're not authentic as a company and you don't really align here, it's going to hurt your business moving forward. It's going to hurt how you can build your culture and retain talent. It's going to hurt how you do partnerships. It's going to hurt your consumer business. It's going to hurt a lot of ways. And by the way, shareholders want to know more. They want to make sure the companies they're investing in that are tied to their reputation are going about it the right way. So businesses you're going to see this reckoning of them really looking at how they go about doing their business and what their relationship is with their employees. To that point, you have to make it part of their core. It has to be a core pillar of everyday business. You can't just do nice things on the side. You need to think through, regardless of what your job is at a company, how are you bringing those principles to life? How are you kind of dealing with partners? What type of partners do you have? How are you measuring that work? All of these things are critical and trying to think it through. Sometimes it's not as clean. We always talk about impact work, about how a company impacts society externally. I like to look internally. How are you doing it? I think it's more important that if you as a company are going about doing things the right way and running your business in the right way, you can shift the rest of the business around you that'll say, you know what, if the NBA does it this way, or BlackRock or AT&T or other companies will follow. And I know it's pushed me as well at times. And I'm like, wow, we really can learn from other companies here and get better. That's what I've always tried to do. So making it a core part of your business is something I emphasize. It has to be a part of business. I am a businessman first and foremost. Yes, I want to grow and have our company be successful. I just feel it can be done in a way that if we go about doing things the right way and we do good, we will do well instead of doing well to do good. And last thing, approach that work with humility and authenticity. I touched on that. It's a learning journey. You have to go on it. You have to be open. You have to realize it's our job to advance the ball here a little bit and pass it on to the next group that's going to go do that. And companies that bring that humility and authenticity will have success long term, because everybody knows at this point, we're all trying to figure it out, right? And I think you got to be real with that, and you have to be direct. And I think the companies that do that, I think people will connect with the most. So that's what I got for you guys. I know I didn't leave a ton of time, but let's take down the slides and jump into any questions.
I'll jump in, Todd. I can't help myself. I have lots of issues and questions, but just, I guess the one that jumps out is that part of what's made the NBA successful is being able to do both at the same time. that is to be socially responsible. I think of Yao Ming and AIDS in China and that kind of touching moment that was good for the world and good for China, but good for the NBA. And then wonder if there's a similar moment that you think about now that kind of touched both sides of it. You know, the NBA people love because it's fun, but it uses its fun and its leadership to make positive change. Is there a moment that's happened over the last 18 months that was like that for you?
Yeah, I would say it was our bubble. So, you know, when we, so people know a little bit behind the scenes here, on March 11th, I was part of the group, you know, that had conversations when the games went, when we had to call the games, right? I found out, like everybody else, and working behind the scenes to see what that was like. Within 11 days, we launched a program called NBA Together to try to figure out how we can use our platform best to kind of support communities. We put out PSAs with the CDC and World Health Organization. We did them directly. But to give you an idea of what I'm talking about in terms of people trusting companies for information, just on our social channels alone, we got 65 million views of those PSAs in 2 weeks, right? So it goes to show you that there's this interest within what the NBA is saying, which, by the way, blows me away, but also keeps us so accountable to making sure that we're providing that information. But really, Bill, I think from a business standpoint, the idea that we were able to launch what people found out to be the bubble in Orlando, I think was the most telling piece about how stakeholder engagement and the alignment around values and trust are so important to doing business. We had to work with the players union, right, and our business and our coaches to come up with a plan that for 3 months, everybody's going to leave their families and move down to an area where we're going to isolate and take care of ourselves to really execute our season. And we said we were going to do that in 3 ways. The first is we're going to bring back, obviously, a world-class product with basketball. The second is we're going to do it safely, right, and convince people that we had this really good plan. And the third is that we're going to use this as an opportunity to talk about social justice work, that all together we were going to do this. So you saw this intersection of the values of who we wanted to be and our business coming together. We needed to do this, right? I think people looked at how we approach it. Other sport leagues approached it differently. And, you know, it turned out to be very successful for us. But for me, just seeing the work that was done there, and by the way, it was across the board for all our colleagues, was incredible. And you see that intersect of the importance of good stakeholder capitalism right there, right? The importance of that relationship, the importance of trust and listening to each other. You know, our commissioner, Adam Silver, is particularly good at that, of bridging that. And there's a trust there where, you know, you people have to take the leap. It is not easy to ask anybody. I know players make a lot of money to leave your family in the height of a pandemic to go play a sport. A lot of our players were very conflicted. It took a lot of time. We all felt that way too. This was a really uncertain time. So that piece was a fascinating exercise of, we had built value and trust within our relationships about how we go about things that allowed us to take that on, that I don't think would have been possible without the community and social responsibility work we've done and the alignment in that space, and players feeling that genuinely the league is aligned and has their best interest in mind, really allowed us to kind of achieve that.
And how are things now? Is the business coming back?
It's a good question. It's a good question. You know, yes. I mean, I think sports and entertainment, we all thought would be the slowest back because people wouldn't want to go into arenas. People would be more nervous. I think it's accelerated more. I was surprised. I don't know if anybody watched the the NBA playoffs, but certainly Madison Square Garden was rocking when the Knicks were back. It was a hard ticket to get. I was shocked at how crowded it was, but that's something that came back very quickly, and it was really, really great to see. I think we did it as safely as we could. You know, Adam and everybody else was so good about looking at our health and safety protocols the entire time, not just about our players, but our fans, and making sure we create a safe environment. And I think part of the reason we've had success here is, again, people saw our track record and said, well, the NBA is approaching this the right way. I think we can trust that. And I think that came a long way. So things have gotten better, but we're not back, right? I think about 40% of our revenue, so people know it's sports, comes from in person. So if you think about that, we lost billions of dollars, as did a lot of the other leagues in that space. And so it's going to take time to fully get back. I'll share with you guys that we did launch our Basketball Africa League in Rwanda And we spun off our MBA Africa business as an investment. Overall, which was a big move, that just happened in the last kind of 2 or 3 months. We also did a bubble in Africa when we did that. And so a lot of movement here was fascinating, but certainly I think our hope is that this next season will get us back on track.
We have
a question in the chat. Hi Todd, how are you? It's great
Hi,
to
how
see
are you?
and
It's
I
good
enjoy
seeing you.
good seeing you too, and I always enjoy your talks. So my question, just wondering, there's these new remote worker policies that have kind of seen people moving away from cities into like suburbs and some other towns that have been economically disadvantaged since, manufacturing has kind of left those places. I'm thinking specifically of like upstate New York. You're hearing about lots of people moving into Kingston, which was not on anyone's radars before, and now is one of the places that it's growing fastest because of all the moving of people there. And I'm just wondering if businesses are going to respond to like this opportunity to maybe invest in some of these places. Like it seems like there would be an opportunity, or is it just one of these things that maybe just isn't part of their CSR? I think it could be an interesting opportunity, just especially because of the elections.
It's a great point. It's great. First of all, it's great to see you. Great to see you. You look great. Yes, I mean, I think it's a big conversation we've had with employees. Employees have spoken up quite a bit about how they feel about things. This is an area that has happened certainly with how safe the office is when we return. Believe it or not, tons of emails. We sent an email, in May, and people were upset that we talked about a return in September. That's 4 months down the road. A year ago, you couldn't fathom that type of response to an email, but that has changed. And I think companies need to rethink about what that means from a working standpoint. The challenge is more HR in terms of people being able to live anywhere that they want and get paid a New York salary. I think there's some sacrifices that would have to happen if you do that. But certainly there's a lot of businesses that, depending on what you do and what your function is, can be a lot more flexible in that. I know Bill, I always loved Bill wrote that story earlier about a four-day work week, but it's that concept times 10, right? Because it really depends on what you do. It could be a 4-week work week. It can be you work remotely when you need to work. It could be a lot of different things depending on what your role is. And I think companies need to take a step back and understand what that is and do it. There are certain roles, and I will say this, when you're new to a company, right, or you're growing your career, there's a value to being around a culture to understand what the expectation is. I will say, as we looked at it with employees that struggled most during the pandemic are those kind of, I would say, ones starting 2 to 4 years in that needed that support or needed the culture push, didn't know when to step in or not. They had a hard time working remotely by themselves. Whereas people that have been doing their jobs for a long time kind of knew what the expectation is, know when they're busy, and can kind of self-manage a little bit more. So I think it really depends on the type of work versus the company itself. But I do think companies are going to have to do that. Although you're starting to see the shift that companies just want everybody back, right? That's all of a sudden. And my hope is that they go more Bill's route, which is really kind of take a step back and say, what's the best way for our business to work and make sure we can be the most productive and we can keep our workforce happy. And I do think there's a median there, and companies should take a page out of their playbook here and really can, I think, could set a competitive advantage moving forward. So I think it's a great suggestion.
Just a comment, Todd, I think there may be a bit of a decentralized HR policy where people could decide in their units, in marketing, in finance, by teams, in your case, by schools at Columbia, setting one policy for 180,000 people at Citibank to me is completely ridiculous, particularly since they're in different countries, which are in different time zones. So I think more about, maybe an overall philosophy, but then a more decentralized HR management might be a way to kind of thread the needle.
Too often what I've noticed, even in my space, is that people go right to tactics and execution without talking about enough around philosophy. And I think that's, that strategy and philosophy of being open to ideas. We talked about being curious, not judgmental. You have to be open to ideas. We have to be willing to talk about these things. Innovation comes from out of the box ideas, right? And entrepreneurship in a company, we are really focused on that the best ideas can come from anywhere. You need to create an avenue and a mechanism to create them. So that strategy is really important to tactics. And I think if companies can focus a little bit more here, it's important. And trust me, it's something we wrestle with all the time. We talk about it because businesses is fast. People don't want to lose shares or opportunities, right? So they ultimately will go for the short-term win because then they can get to the next thing. They'll deal with it later. But that strategy piece you're talking about now, there needs to be space to do that work. And the companies that have allowed that to happen, and Amazon, I don't love to talk about it. There was an article about how they try products and sell products. They do a lot of that type of stuff. You want to see more of that from companies, but certainly from an HR standpoint, it's going to be a competitive advantage to how you recruit talent, right? And companies are, if one or two companies do it, others will follow. And I think you saw that with parental leave and other things. So I do expect it, but you're right, Bill. I think that's spending time on the strategy of like, what's the philosophy here? And then allowing the execution and the tactics to really follow what the work is versus a universal policy makes a lot more sense.
Would you have time for one last question? We have one in the chat.
Yep.
From Sergey.
Just go. Yes. Lazov.
Hello. Hi. How are you? Very good. Good to see you. Thanks really for this amazing talk. Just a comment, if you can. A couple of months ago, Warner Media merged with Discovery, and I had a chance to see the roundtable they organized at CNN, because CNN was directly affected by the merger. And you know what surprised me really is that they never, the CEOs or whoever, these top people, they never even mentioned stakeholders. Every other phrase was about shareholders. Our shareholders will like it, our shareholders will support it. And whenever the moderator even tried to go there, they kind of refused. Is it a little bit concerning, given the fact that this is like a media business, given all the polarization and entrenchment? That's any comment if you made. It's not.
I mean, it was. I mean, from a business standpoint, it was obviously an incredible merger, and there were definitely some winners and losers on that. Look, I don't know at the time when they did the merger, obviously they're more focused on their shareholder and their stock. Probably that's why you saw, I don't know if you saw on CNBC or whatever they're talking about, but I think eventually they're going to have to address that front and center. It's going to be most important, particularly when you're merging companies, what that's going to mean. But yes, I mean, I do feel it is something they're going to have to address. I'm just maybe it's just they're not quite there yet. It'll be interesting to see who they bring in to do that, and what that's going to mean longer term. But that's such a seismic shift in the business. Certainly it impacted us as well. To see kind of what they do will be interesting. And the leadership there is good. So I assume they'll be doing it right. Sorry, Jack, go ahead.
Sorry, I think my colleague Sanjay had his hand up first.
No, go ahead, Jack. Go ahead, Jack.
Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you, Professor Jacobson. Really fantastic talk. Really left me with a lot to think about. I took my stepdaughter to last night's Liberty game. It was fantastic, and the sort of the social justice presence in throughout the proceedings was really, I thought, really meaningful and really authentically done, to your point earlier. I was wondering, and hope I'm not overstepping, when we look at a league like the National Football League, which dominates revenue in professional sports, as an NBA fan, as a basketball fan, I see the NBA and partners with a very long view perspective on how social justice impacts revenues 50 years into the future. Do you have a sense of whether the 800-pound gorilla in the room, like the NFL, is having any of the conversations or thoughtful considerations that your league appears to be engaged in?
They are. I know the NFL and I know my colleagues well, and they have done some tremendous work. I think, unfortunately, some of it, I think they've gotten some fair, some unfair in terms of some of that stuff. I don't like to comment on it. I think they go about doing great work. and we just try to do what we do. We talk all the time with them, and they do. And I know they started the Players Fund and have done a lot of really great work in social justice. They just had a player come out, which I think is a huge step in sports. I'm really excited to see that. And so, they do tremendous work. And so, I don't like to comment on that stuff. I don't think it's appropriate, but I do feel that the sports community in general is really supportive and always trying to do that work. And, we all are doing it. We're all trying to do the best we can. And, but certainly I know, those at the NFL are working hard at it and have done a lot of really good work in this space.
Thank you.
Yep. Sanjay, and then I got to jump. I'm sorry, I have to do another presentation.
My question is pretty straightforward, simple, and it is social impact as a business. It seems to, and again, it's come to the fore in the last year a lot more than it has come. And I guess it's been part of the repertoire for a very long time. It seems like either the big players who have all the resources are making bigger statements, or the very small player who's just starting and is trying to be relevant into their community. What's happening in the middle section? Like, is there everybody else talking, or is it just the small and the big?
It's both. I mean, I think that companies are trying to figure it out. Sanjay, to your point, I mean, the reason they have to figure it out is they have to survive and thrive, right? And I think the focal point of business moving forward, and the idea of the CEO saying companies need to approach things a little bit differently to have sustainable success long term is important, right? You're always trying to build out of how you're going to do that. And so this area, which has been a very niche area for a lot of times, is becoming more front and center. But the piece that I've always stressed for companies is it's more a philosophy of how they're going to approach this overall. That they, we talked a little bit about that strategy, but what are their values and how are they going to look at this work is something all companies need to go through. By the way, it's not just about responding liberally to things. There's some conservative companies that have very set policies of, we're not going to do politics in the workplace. That's what they decided to do. I think companies need to be clear about their path forward and understand, who their consumers are and what they're trying to do to set the tone. I think, when you look at a company like Nike that has done very well, when they put out that Kaepernick ad, they actually lost a little market share. People in the market were like, well, Nike's going to alienate people. But Nike in their mind was thinking, well, we know who our core audience is. This is who we're trying to talk to. This is what we know what we're about. And that they actually wound up selling more product after that. So knowing who you are, being clear about your values, not trying to just be reactive to things, is how business is going to have to move forward. All businesses. And so this is going to be part of doing business moving forward. So yes, there's companies in the middle, but where they need to land is, who are they? How are they going to approach how they're going to do their work, so that they have a roadmap moving forward to dealing with these things? Because if you're just going to react, companies are going to make big missteps, and that can really hurt how you go about doing your business and how you maximize your profits. This is what businesses ultimately want to do as well, right? So it's going to be a mix there. We're going to see it, but I suspect most companies are going to start going through that transition, even if they decide not to do certain things, just to be clear how they're going to address things moving forward.